to another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me as always is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
Doing good, Jody. I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm feeling extra energetic. I've done my skiing and also my morning workout today, so I'm pumped. Even though I don't sound like it.
So we're going to have to keep this short because you're going to about fade in about 20 minutes here is what were you trying to say?
Maybe.
Maybe. All right. Well, might be a lot of me at the end then.
Yeah, all right.
I wanted to mention something if people are playing along at home. A couple of episodes ago, we were talking about backups and things. And if anybody's keeping score at home, I ended up going with a RAID system for my backup.
Yay!
There you go. So now you can sleep at night knowing that I'm backing up to a RAID system.
I know I'll get an extra hour of that tonight.
I know, because I know people have been clamoring for the answer to that question, what solution I was going to go with. So I thought I'd throw it out there. All right. That's not what we're talking about today.
And automations and better workflow. We're talking about what today?
Control surfaces today. And I suppose we should mention that we're thinking in this episode, we're not talking about keyboard controllers, that kind of thing, that can have added functionality. We'll touch on that a little bit, but we're talking about more from a mixing workflow standpoint type of vibe here.
Right, the kind that looks like an actual console that people used to plug into. Actually, a lot of people still do, but yes.
Yeah, more or less that. So the first question I guess we should throw out there, or that I will throw out there to you, in a world full of keyboard and mouse type of workflow, why do we need a control surface?
For that human element of touch.
Yeah.
That's the best answer I can give.
All right, cool. So Friday finds.
Yes.
No.
It's the human element of things. And the reason why I say that is if people keep going back to catalog music from, I don't know, say the 70s or 80s or whatever, before automation really took complete hold of the industry, you used to have an army of people, apparently, to do a singular mix.
Certainly possible, yeah. The more advanced mix you would have, and you're doing all these fader moves across, you might have needed more than
two hands,
10 fingers or two hands, right? Yeah.
If you watch something like Mix with the Masters that they did with Al Schmidt in those videos, and you watch some of the stuff that he's doing, he's got his fingers up on the faders at all times. And this guy was a master of this stuff, of being able to just move the fader and not use a ton of EQ and compression in order to get a great sound out of a recording. He knew where to place a mic, and then he knew how to ride the faders. That's how it was done back then. Then along came automation and made a whole world of change.
Right.
And the initial systems that were available back then were kind of bizarre. I recall one particular system that a good friend of mine had with ADATs that connected to a console of sorts that had the motorized faders and such. And I believe it was made by Mackie. And it was not the Mackie control, but it was something precursor to this, because the software was not built into the unit, and the unit itself was not dedicated to anything but the software that it ran with on a computer. That was how my first recording experience was mixed, was using that automated system from Mackie. And I wish I knew the exact name of it, but I do not. And I've tried looking it up, and I can't recall what it is, and the internet doesn't seem to know either.
Yeah. It is a different feel there. And I think, to backtrack a little bit before we go into the whole Mackie story and the Mackie controls, there is something with sort of like fingers and hands on knobs and faders that obviously feels different. Yeah, it's the tactile notion of that. And also, when you're sitting and you're mixing with a mouse, you're generally, unless of course you're grouping and things and sending to AUXs or VCAs and things, you're generally moving one fader and one parameter at a time, right? So now you have the ability to obviously do more, and you can have what can feel like a little bit more of a natural movement to levels and things, and you can do a fader ride and as simple as like a pan automation type of thing at the same time. So I think there's a certain, not to sound too hippie-ish here, but it is that human element that you mentioned, like when you're doing that, you're kind of getting into it a little bit more and you can feel a little bit more connected to that. So I think there are huge benefits to that, presuming you like that workflow.
I don't disagree with any of that. And one thing that I will say about it in the difference between working with a mouse and keyboard as opposed to a control surface is the amount of data that you'll see in the automation, or that you could see in the automation, I should say. In that,
you mean the little nodes if you're
the little nodes
at,
and I'm thinking in terms of like Logic, but all the DAWs that have automation and nodes and that kind of thing do the same thing. I recall very early on, after the Mackie software and getting into recording with Logic, when it first started doing audio, which I can't even recall what version, maybe version 4.
Yeah.
It's a very, very long time ago.
That's when you turned me on to Logic. That's when I got onto the train.
Yeah.
It was 4.6, I think.
Yeah, so I think they actually added audio functionality in 4.0. Prior to that, it was all MIDI. And the automation that I remember in difference between using a mouse and using a control surface is that the automation nodes that you saw with hand-done control surface nodes is there's a bazillion of them all over the place. But with mouse use, I was very, very precise. It's like, at this point, I want to start doing this, and at that point, it's going to end doing that. And he had 2 nodes, and then you could do a curve or something that Logic allowed you to do, which was pretty cool. And it took out the concept of doing all of the fader moves, and it was a different way to work. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse. However, control surfaces have come a long way since the days of that early Mackie system prior to Mackie control.
Absolutely. But I remember, let's go into that a little bit more of the Mackie, I suppose, because I remember seeing at NAMM some year, presumably late 90s, when they showed the Huey control, which was the first Mackie control. And there was a version, we were talking about that a little bit before we started recording here, how there was actually a version called the Logic control.
Yeah, it was made by Mackie.
It was made by Mackie, but I think it was maybe a year or something prior to them releasing it as just the Mackie Huey, and you had different overlays that you could do for different DAWs because it just functioned via MIDI, right? But you could control pretty much everything in Logic through this, right? So it's like you could essentially put your mouse aside and do a lot of the functionality if you were of that workflow where you had perhaps done and cut your teeth working on a console. That would feel very much comfortable to you to have all of that there.
Well, it was a lot of fun, actually, because eMagic actually sent me one.
Yeah.
and allowed me to mess around with it and play with it and give feedback and whatnot. It was very much like operating with a console, but controlling the DAW instead.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun to work with. I don't discount it. I think it was great.
Yeah,
Is it as good as what you get today? No, but it was definitely cutting edge at the time it came out.
But it's still around today. I mean, they still sell them. They've been upgraded a little bit. Well, the Mackie Huey.
Well, the Mackie Huey, they've gone from normal MIDI 1.0 to MIDI 2.0, which increases the resolution of what you.
Are they actually doing MIDI 2.0 on the new Mackie?
I believe so. It goes.
That surprises me, actually, if you do.
A lot further along, so to speak, in terms of like, instead of 127 steps, you get like 16,000 some steps or more. The big problem that I remember early on with these controllers is that on early MIDI, having 127 or depending on how you count it, 128 steps, you could hear the zipper noise or you could hear the movement of things because it's not as gradual as it is with an analog device, but now with MIDI 2.0, that's not really a thing anymore. You get a much higher resolution. It's come a long way since the days of the Logic control and the Huey from Mackie, the early days of those.
Is it for everybody? Maybe not, but it is something to consider. And then obviously there's a lot of things that we'll talk about down the line here a little bit that you have to consider. But first, I suppose we should touch on also if we hype these things too much here, but are there drawbacks
Yeah.
to this?
Of course there are.
What's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
If I step back and reiterate what I just said about the early days of these things in MIDI 1.0, you heard zipper noise. Not so much that you actually heard noise, but you could actually hear the different steps happening if you were trying to go one by one. So it wasn't very smooth in that regard. And it was a lot better to actually create one node to another using a mouse and allowing Logic to do the actual automation, because it was much higher resolution at that point, which is why I didn't stick with the Logic control. The other thing that you have to think about is, especially with the modern era of recording and laptops in general, and maybe headphones, having a control surface is definitely going to make you a lot less mobile.
This is true, depending on the
just
size.
A mouse and a laptop. There is one that I believe it's a PreSonus.
The fader port.
Fader port. It's a singular thing, and it's quite small. You could use that, but then again, that's almost akin to using a mouse because it's kind of controlling pretty much one thing at a time. The idea of having a much larger unit that has like 8 or 16 faders on it is to be able to manipulate multiple things at once.
Yeah, no, I think of that obviously as well when it comes to the mobility. Let's say that you do a lot of traveling and things, logging around a console will, definitely hamper that somewhat. Mm-hmm. And other smaller control surfaces that are geared very much toward the traveling musician, if you will. We have these, sure. I think is it Akai or Korg that have their nano controls. They're these tiny little things, but I suppose they're more geared toward programming things, right? When you're programming perhaps drum patterns or something, as opposed to a mixing workflow. So it's a little bit more of an input device, I think, when it comes to that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to sidestep that for a little bit right now and just talk about that. And another thing, of course, is besides the mobility issue, there is an expense. If this is not going to fit your workflows, if you're not doing a whole lot of mixing, multi-track type of stuff, sure, it might look cool in your space, but do you want to spend $55,000 for a flagship S4?
Yeah, that's the thing to consider for sure. The other thing you have to think about is the learning curve that it takes to set it up with whatever system that you're using, especially in the age of everything trying to be intercompatible. And not everything is exactly the same from DAW to DAW to controller. Your comment about the expense and having it being there reminds me of a story I read about a couple of guys from Europe who were producers, and they came to LA, and nobody wanted to work with them because they didn't have an actual console in their recording environment. So they went out and dropped
House Mafia?
Yes, it's something like that. Star something or other. I can't remember exactly what they were called, but they ended up buying SSL board just to stick in there that did nothing. It was literally hooked up to nothing. It was just there.
It's a laptop stand.
Yeah. It's baffling to me. It's like, really? That's crazy.
Well, there is that. Optics is very important, right? We talked about, the 480. If you have an empty controller on your or remote on your desk, that looks happening. There is that. So for me, I have a small controller. I have an old Behringer of all things, but it's primarily for how I like to have the ability to use faders and just quick panning automation. I like that feel and just to kind of see it in front of me in doing small fader moves. I would love to have a larger consoles type of controller, but I find that what's out there for me in my workflow, it's either not enough or way too much functionality for what I want.
Is there such thing as too much functionality?
Well, it is because it's, I would love to have something like, a 24-channel thing, but the investment and the return of that for me, I'm buying sort of like a trailer to go get my mail in. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. It's too much of an investment for that. But that's me. I like the hands-on feel. It's something I'm a big fan of, but I would like to have more, but we'll talk about more what's available out there and see what might be work for you as well.
What's other things that we need to look at are in comparison from a controller to a keyboard controller, say?
There are keyboard controllers that have obviously assignable faders and knobs and things that you can assign to your DAW so that you could have that sort of a movable fader, for example, for your volume or whatever, your master or whatever the track that you're working on. You can assign any knob to control pretty much anything in your DAW. Mm-hmm. The drawback of that is that you have to assign it to something in your DAW. It's not instant, right?
And it's stuck there too.
Right, it's stuck there too. So you have to really, really think through your workflow to have this set up in a manner that it works. And it's not necessarily going to change till you go to the next track and then the same knob controls the same parameter on that channel. It can be a little bit clunky. I know there are companies that, I want to say it was Novation, that had MIDI controllers that were set up for different DAWs, and it was supposed to be seamless. I haven't worked with them, so I can't really say, but I heard a lot of noise that people were not necessarily that happy with. It wasn't as seamless as advertised type of thing.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, but I think that's also the nature of the beast, right? Because DAWs upgrade and this and that and things get changed. And so trying to control every DAW and have that set up in one unit, that's a pretty lofty task.
It's a tall order. With a tall order, we're going to take a moment for a word from our sponsors. And we're back. And now we're going to jump into a little bit of like a rundown of people who actually make these things. So kick us off, Chris.
Well, we mentioned the Mackie early, but that's the first one that comes to mind for me when I think of a controller, because I think the implementation that they did with that one was really, really good and well planned out. The Huey now, it had extenders for that, so you could add, like, if people don't know, it was essentially a control section of it and 8 faders and possibly a 9th for master.
Yes. It also had a jog wheel as well.
Right. So you had all this sort of functionality, navigation and things and transport controls on that master section. But then what you could do is that if you wanted more faders, you could buy extenders to this that added an additional 8. And I'm not sure if there was a limit to how many of those you could have, but 2 extenders, now you got like a 24 fader desk in front of you, right?
Right.
So I think that was a really, really cool one. I already mentioned that I have a dusty old Behringer here, and I'm not going to go into what I think of Behringer's business practices. That's beyond the scope of this episode anyway.
Let's get some dynamite and blow it up for a video.
Could be interesting, perhaps. I like the functionality. It works pretty darn well with Logic. Now, my biggest gripe on this bad boy is it's a noisy little bugger. The motorized faders is... yeah, it's loud.
So they're not Penny and Giles is what you're saying.
They are not top dollar faders is exactly what I'm saying. Now, with the newer versions that they have a new, it's called the X-Touch. I'm hoping they're better. They probably are. But again, they have different versions of that where you have more of a control, kind of like transport and functionality of your DAW in one, and then they have other they're just like faders. For me, I think the fader part is more exciting because I don't know about you. Actually, I do know about you. But I do obviously not know about all our listeners here. My guess is that most users have a good grasp of controlling their DAW's playback function using their keyboard. For me, it's like that is so integrated in the workflow. That has very little to do with a mouse. I've always felt that with a control surface, the transport controls are sort of like redundant to me. I'm like, well, why would you do that? No, it's space bar. That's how you start and stop shit, right? And, navigating back and forth. So I think that's, for me, again, that's a functionality that's not out there. Anyway, I digress. We have the Behringer stuff.
Yes.
You mentioned the PreSonus. They have their fader port, and that is a growing series. We have, you mentioned, the single fader, which is something I've considered as well.
Well, it's something they sent me to use and tried it out. And when it was initially out, it unfortunately didn't function very well. They've since improved that, so it's definitely a lot better. And they have it in various configurations now. They have the single fader port. They also have one with 8 faders, and then they have one with 16 faders, and they are modular, which makes them very nice. So if you wanted to get a whole lot of faders together, you could buy a couple of 16 fader port units, link them together, and you got 32 faders on your desktop right there. And they do a very good job of controller.
But not necessarily extenders, though. You're just buying another unit, right?
Yeah,
so
but
you
they
would
work
have
together.
multiple. Yeah, I'm a big fan of having that, just the faders. But anyway, that's me. One thing on the fader port that hopefully somebody from PreSonus is listening. One thing that I thought was a glaring omission from on those, because I strongly consider them at this point, and I still might, we'll see. Each fader doesn't have an individual panning port. So you have to go up and assign something to one wheel. If you, for example, let's say that you have a stereo pair that you're going to affect at the same time, you have to do that in 2 passes because you can't do it unless you sort of like assign it to the faders. But now there's more operations. So I would love to have like just a dedicated pan pot on top of each fader.
I hear you.
But that's the fader ports. You know, we kind of mentioned the smaller ones from like Novation and Korg and Akai and all those smaller input type of things that could be good for input type of stuff if you're the musician on the go, if you will. These all work with pretty much any DAW, right? They kind of like more or less plug and play because they just use MIDI protocol, and there's some setup in your DAW, but they work all the way through. What else we got?
Softtube makes a thing called the console. And they have a version of Mark II. It's a dedicated controller for their particular software, but Universal Audio is on board with them as well. And it's a little bit more of a dedicated controller, specifically for their software and for quite a few of the UA plugins that gives you a very tactile way to work with those particular offerings.
So I think those look very appealing to me as well. The initial one came out and it didn't have the fader section of it. It was just knobs.
Right.
So that was one of those things that you kind of have to wrap your head around that. I'm controlling level with a knob as opposed to a fader. Just like, well, that's weird, right? Yeah. But now they have that. And from what I understand, the way it works is you load their console plugin on your channel strip, on each channel.
Yep.
You open that and that will control all the parameters that you might need. So that's a cool thing because it has a full channel strip, essentially. You got compression, you got EQ, and all this kind of stuff there. That's a really, really cool one. Now we're stepping up a little bit in price range here. We're doing these as well, but it's supposed to be cool. It's going to cost, right?
What would be the next one in the price range?
I would, about the same ballpark there, I think, but the SSLs that have come out. We mentioned those. I think both you or I probably at one point had them as our Friday find at the UF8. And they look sexy. They look really, really cool. And they also have their sort of dedicated plug-in controller for the SSL channel strip, and that's the
UC1.
UC1. Again, that looks really, really cool. But now, as opposed to being open and assignable to any kind of plug-in, now we're dedicated to a certain thing, which is awesome if you're using the SSL software,
right?
Because now you have the functionality of that right at your fingertips, and you don't have to mouse around. So there's that. Another sort of first that where we talked about the Mackie and stuff.
Euphonics.
There you go. So tell us about the Euphonics.
They were a very sexy looking unit when they came out. There's no question about it. They were extremely sexy. And they were made with high quality stuff like the Penny and Giles faders and everything. So you knew that they were of decent, actually not even just decent, is really good quality. Then they got bought out by Avid and things changed. They still look sexy. They're still good controllers, but they're made mostly of plastic, and that's just meh to me. And as much as I like the look of them and the way they actually connect, they connected with Ethernet cable. Instead of
that was different.
Instead of the USB,
cable,
which also gave them a higher resolution in terms of how they could give you the information, which is a good thing. The Euphonics, the EU control, now owned by Avid, they probably just call it a Pro Tools controller.
I think, the Avid controller that kind of come in. And then, of course, now we're sort of stepping up and we're getting into the sort of Avid ecosystem here.
The high-end market.
There's that, but it's also could be not necessarily low end. I don't want to say that because it certainly isn't. But they have their S series now, right? Which I think is, at least at the time of taping of this, is the current version, where it has what looks like, I want to say euphonics controller, but I'm going to slip on the tongue. But I mean the Avid controller that has the fader and functionality, but you can actually add an iPad to it. To run an ad that adds the metering on it. They look really, really cool. And I think whether you're somebody who runs Pro Tools at home and you want to have this kind of functionality, that might be a way to go. But certainly the larger ones that are there in post houses and things like that tend to be predominantly Pro Tools, right?
Right.
They look really, really cool because, again, these grow and you can have several of these. And we talked about, I can't remember how we talked about it, but it was like Captain Kirk, right? You're sitting at the Star Trek command and you got all of these and they look sexy as all hell. So now, the sort of combination there, I'm thinking of touchscreen and hardware. So you're kind of starting to blur those lines a little bit, I think.
Well, you can go even further with actual touchscreens and not even go with the kind of hardware. You got the iPad has the dedicated Logic Control app.
Yeah.
So it's
what's your experience with that? Have you messed with that?
I have. I think without a hardwire, it becomes a little bit behind the curve, so to speak. It's not quite as right on the money as one would hope.
Yeah.
But it's not bad. It's good for what it is.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about going over Bluetooth. It's not really the most ideal way to do things, but it's definitely something that can get you into the control surface mindset without having to buy the hardware.
Yeah.
And it's free.
Right.
With Logic.
Right. Funny thing with Apple, we think that, well, there's no dongle. Yeah, there is a dongle. It just costs you $3,000 and that's your computer.
And your iPad.
Right. Then it's kind of ironic here with the Logic controls because now there really isn't a tactile thing anymore.
Right.
It is in that you're using your finger, but you're not feeling a fader or a knob or anything. So I've heard people that just swear by them. Like, yeah, I try to get into XYZ controller, but this is what works best for me. For the Logic
everybody's got their preferences.
One thing that's cool, though, with these is if you're the type of artist that you're tracking yourself, or let's say that you're a singer or you're a drummer, you might be tracking in a different situation, not in front of your computer.
It does make it easy for that.
So you can trigger everything that you do from your controller. You can just have it basically on your iPhone, in your vocal booth or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Just turn off notifications when you do.
Right.
Yeah.
Then there's the really like high-end version of the whole touchscreen thing. And I know there's been multiple companies that have been trying to do it, but Slate Digital is pretty much the one company that's made it a reality on a scale that a lot of people have purchased into, and that's their Raven series.
Yeah, those look really, really cool as well.
They do. And
they even
get
have
big hands-on thing, but it's all touchscreen.
It's all touchscreen, and you could have multiples of them, and you can do all your editing. So now you're editing without your keyboard, right? If you choose to, right? And there's that in mixing without your keyboard. Everything is sort of like hands on deck. And they, again, if you go back to the optics of things, like it looks pretty darn impressive if you got these like built units for them that houses two of these. And you walk in and you really get the Star Wars effect. And it's like, wow, they look cool. So there is that. And I mentioned before the flagship sort of version of this current version of the S controllers from Avid is that the S424 channel. But then you're plonking out some serious cash. It's like 55,000 plus. Like if you get one of those. So for most sort of like project or home studios, it might be a little bit excessive.
A little overkill.
The Ravens, I think, I don't know what they're not that expensive comparatively. I could be wrong, but I think that the Ravens themselves are about $1,500.
Oh, well, that's reasonable.
That's kind of cool. So what's your thoughts? Do you have favorite functionalities? I know you've had some different controllers through the years that you kind of mentioned, but What's your sort of like favorite functionality? What would you like to see? What turns you off them if they do? And what's the biggest appeal to you?
How much they can control. If they can't control a certain amount of the DAW, it's not very viable to me. I'd rather just use a mouse if I have to go with a lack of control, so to speak. So setting something up that is constantly in need of being taught to the DAW, and do the learn function. It's very easy. It's nice, but at the same time, if it's one item per controller, that becomes unuseful. With the new ones like the SSL UF8, oh, that's a sexy beast right there. And the next time I dive into purchasing a controller, that's the controller I'm looking at getting, is the UF8.
Yeah, they do look really, really cool.
And they're made of metal. I mean, they're a solid piece of kit. That's the reason why I go for that. I don't want something technically made from plastic. I want something that's got heft to it.
It feels like a solid unit. It
feels like it's a real unit kind of thing.
You're not going to break it when you start aggressively mixing.
That's right. And, I like to aggressively mix. I get in there. I want to work it. So,
as one does,
yes.
Right? Yeah. From my viewpoint, there's basically just two things that I would love, and I would love to see somebody actually do this. And that would be to have an extended range, like let's say up to 24 faders, smooth faders, and just a pan knob assigned to each. I don't
No
care
additional knobs other than the pan knob and the fader?
Not necessarily, because there could be, but then you're getting into that same thing. It's like, well, what are they assigned to? And do I have to do the assignment of them? So for me in my workflow, I think I would because I like the overview of seeing all the faders where they are, being able to control them without having to go through different pages and that type of thing.
Yep.
And just control level and a pan. If there were other ones for, like, let's say inserts for a couple, just send levels, that would be awesome. But that's all I would like. I don't think anybody makes one like that. If somebody knows about them, please let me know, because I would love to check it out. So all the other transport functions and automation modes and all this kind of stuff, I do that through my keyboard. That workflow has been doing it for a minute. So all those things that you do without thinking about them, what kind of key commands you're hitting and all this kind of stuff. That's my take on it. I would love to have something like that. And then I'm sure somebody smarter than I am can implement something that's going to be that I had not thought about. So, but you can also do this. I'll be more than willing to listen.
So are you saying that you need a control surface or no?
Need is a strong word. Like one, yes. I like something because I feel like doing fader moves and things as you're in the workflow is so much easier just putting a hand on a fader and moving that and just the tactile feeling of doing rides and whether it's panning or what have you. I like that feel. Is it a need? It's close to it for me. Is that for everybody? No, not at all. We've been working with a mouse and keyboard for the better part of 25 years, right? So it's certainly doable. That's my take on it. It depends on your workflow, man, but I like the ability to do that. What about you?
In terms of mixing, I like a more tactile function, but I'm also a stickler for precision. And sometimes I hate that about myself.
You get that anal retentive nature when the fading line is not completely,
So in that regard, do you need a control surface? No. Do I want one? Yes. Do I want one made cheaply? No. Do I want one made extremely well that controls a lot of functions? Yes. That's why, as I stated earlier, the SSL UF8 is the one I've got my eye on.
I mean, everybody ultimately has to make up their minds, but I think the feeling of a finger on a fader and stuff and just being able to do rides in several at once is a different feel. I'm pro control surface, but that's me.
Hey, you know what?
What's that?
It's Friday Fine time. What you got for us, Chris?
Spitfire Audio, favorite developer of mine, just released a new series of their Origin series, and it's a library called Frozen Strings. that I think sounds really, really cool. If you're unaware of Origins, it's kind of like a scaled down version of some of their other sample libraries. They're really, really cost effective. I mean, I think they're like $29 or something. Frozen strings is a string library that is being performed at, they say, like at the point of silence almost. Like, so there's really, really these delicate textures and great for soundtrack sounding kind of stuff. And I like that kind of thing. So my Friday fun for this week has to be Frozen Strings by Spitfire Audio. And you, good sir, what you got for us?
I'm going with Isotope this week. Their RX9 de-hum module.
Yeah?
Yes. I was working on a mix the other day, and there's some awful hum in the guitar tracks.
You don't say.
I do say. So I ended up pulling out the de-hum plugin and taking a noise print of one of the guitar tracks, and it did a brilliant job of removing that particular hum from the situation. On another guitar track, the hum was in the actual guitar sound, so to speak. So it wasn't printed, like you couldn't take a noise print of it. And I ended up using a preset of the noise removal of hum, and it figured out that it was at like 59.725 hertz or something crazy like that, and it automatically removed that particular hum. So it was really amazing. It was almost magical in a sense of having that hum removed and getting the glassy guitar sound back. It was really, really amazing. So that's my pick for this week.
Awesome.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you post about us on your favorite forum or go to our website and leave a review at insidetherecordingstudio.com/review. Go to insidetherecordingstudio.com and sign up for our email list. Doing so will get you weekly reminders about the Tuesday tips when they come out, and will make sure you don't miss any future episodes of the podcast that you love so much. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at insidetherecordingstudio.com with the phrase control surface, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic of suggestion for us to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page, and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. And with that, I'll say, see you next week.
Have a good one, Jody. Thanks for listening to me babble.